guys about ready? All right. Well, welcome once again to our February edition of Band of Brothers. And we are pleased to have our birthday boy back there, birthday number 217. And we're going to introduce him after we do a few songs. I want you to get to hear our front row quartet. So come on up here, guys.
We haven't sung yet. Don't get too excited.
We're not going to applaud them.
Okay. The stripe down on the end is Nick Butler. He's our baritone. Fred Kite is our white stripe. He is does Cracker Barrel up in Gallatin. You've been up there. You probably met.
You've seen me.
You've seen Fred, and he's our bass man. And then Brian Patrick is our original lead singer from the front row. And then he decided to have a little family, so he said, hey, I got to take a break. So we had to replace him, but I said, hey, he can't come tonight, can you? He said, sure. So we're going to do a few that you know. One of them, I want to start with the first one, just to throw some barbershop, a song out, and then we'll get into some songs that you know. And the local boy arranged this one. Mr. Larry Gatlin arranged Hallelujah.
When spoke
And if you don't know the words to this one, well, you probably know the words, but don't sing them because it really screws us up. A little introduction to this song. This song was written in September of 1814 when young Abe was only 5.5 years old. He was still in Kentucky, I believe, at the time, before he moved to Indiana. But a gentleman was invited onto a British battleship to try to convince somebody's release of an American soldier. And while he was there, they started the bombardment of the Battle of Baltimore. And he was there for 25 hours of bombardment on this boat. And he wrote a poem, and you all know the poem. And so we thought it would be great to introduce our president with our national anthem.
Stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, for the ramparts we so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Front row, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, Kat, for bringing the family. All right, it's time to introduce the man of the hour. A man celebrating his 217th birthday. Come on up here, Mr. President.
Well. Good evening.
Front row, hey.
Good evening.
Good evening. Front row wanted to make sure you had a birthday card. I didn't want you to go home
thank you
without
very much.
one.
I told the young lady earlier I don't feel any older than 189. You know? Drink a lot of water. Well, I want to thank Charlie for asking me to be here tonight. He seems to have a habit of this, and he had asked me if I would try to say something about our nation's upcoming birthday. 250 years. 250 years. You know, I pondered all of that time, what were the struggles, what were the trials and tribulations that those 56 men went through to get our Declaration of Independence? And you know, you get that many men in one room, and everybody thinks they're smarter than the other one. You know, that's the reason it just went on and on and on. Well, you know, Mr. Jefferson had started that document. And of course, everybody would get a little preview of it. And Mr. Jefferson, even though he was a slave owner himself, was going to put specific language in the Declaration that would gradually, over time, do away with the institution of slavery. Well, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, several others said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. We almost did not become a country. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when Benjamin Franklin goes to Thomas Jefferson. I can hear that conversation now. Mr. Franklin says, now, Tom, what are we trying to do here? What's our main thing? What we're trying to do is get our freedom from the motherland. That's what we want. Now, Tom, let's get this done first, and we'll deal with that later on. So we need to thank Mr. Franklin for encouraging Thomas Jefferson. But you see, it said all men are created equal, but they weren't. We're still trying to live up to that great document. You know, the founding fathers, all of them, most all of them, were my heroes, but I had some that were my very favorite. My first, of course, was George Washington. Now, you see, my grandfather, who I was named after, he was in the militia during the Revolutionary War. And my papa, when he was a little boy, my grandpa would tell him about all these battles and all the struggles that the country went through, and it was all about George Washington this, George Washington that. Well, I found out that there was a fellow, we were living over in Indiana then, and there was a fellow over there named Josiah Crawford, and he had a copy of Weems' Life of Washington. Oh, I almost ran when I found it out. And he, by the way, Mr. Crawford was about the most unruly man in the whole county there. You know, hardly anybody liked him because he couldn't get along with anybody. But he had that book, and I said, if you'll let me borrow this book, I will give you my oath. I will take very good care of it. And he looked at me and he said, well, Abraham, books cost a lot of money. I said, well, I'll give you my word. I will take excellent care. I took it home and I devoured it. I mean, I read it over and over and over. One night, I was up in the loft, and I had just finished it, and I blew out my candle, and I stuck the book in the eave of the house, right up there, with this part out. It came a blowing rain, and it got the cover absolutely soaking wet. I had to go to Crawford and tell him what I'd done, and then tell him how sorry that I didn't have any money. He looked down from that old mule he was on. He said, well, boy, you ain't got to have no money, but you're going to pay for my book. He made me work in his cornfield for 3 days from sunup to sundown. That's the price I paid for one book. It taught me 2 very valuable lessons, though. First of all, that I should always be very careful with anything that I borrowed from someone else, and more important, that I should always be responsible enough to keep my word. If you're going to make a promise or a pledge, you need to keep it. And, you know, to my joy, he gave me the book. You know, that book's on my office desk in Washington right now. I've never gotten rid of it. But now, one of my other favorite founding fathers, and you might find this difficult, was Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine, he was kind of an unusual character, you know, and he had written a book called The Age of Reason, you know, and I read that book. I have to tell you, when I left my folks when I was 21 and moved to New Salem, I had read Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. As a matter of fact, I fell in with a group of agnostics and atheists. We used to argue religion, you know. I have given that argument up for many years now, but I did. Now, my third favorite was Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. I tell you, the man must have been a genius. But again, those men, the struggles they went through to get this done. My friends, if you have listened to suggestions, if you have been taught doctrines conflicting with those great landmarks of the Declaration of Independence, if you have listened to suggestions that would take away its grandeur, if you're inclined to believe that all men are not created equal by those inalienable rights enumerated by our Charter of Liberty, let me entreat you to come back. Now think nothing of me. Take no thought of the political fate of any man whatsoever, but come back to the truths that are in the Declaration of Independence. If that declaration is not the truth, then let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. Who is so bold to do it? My friends, I have never had a feeling politically or patriotically that did not spring directly from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I believe today, especially today, more than any other time, we need to remind ourselves of the great price that was paid for that independence, of who paid it and how the price was paid. Because of the many struggles that our nation has endured, we Americans have become more attached to one another, more firmly bound to this country in which we inhabit. And because of the great sacrifices already made, and for the great sacrifices yet to be made, we will all of us be better men, women, and children in this age and time and country in which we live. Now, we speak a lot about rights, freedom, and liberty in this country of ours. I've always believed that each individual is naturally entitled to do as he pleases with himself and the fruits of his labor, so long as it does not interfere in any other man's rights. We speak a lot about liberty, and yet the world has never had a good definition of the word liberty. I believe the American people, as well as the world, are just now in great need of one. Now, I hope that all of us here this evening, I hope that we speak out on behalf of liberty. But my friends, when we use the same word, we don't all mean the same thing. For example, the shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, and the sheep praise the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf, who was only trying to feed his starving family, denounces the shepherd as a destroyer of liberty. It's plain that the wolf and the sheep cannot agree upon what that word means, and that same difference prevails among some people in this world today. But just what constitutes the bulwark of our freedom, our liberty, and our independence? It's not our frowning battlements, our bristling seacoasts, or our armies and navies. You see, all these things could be turned against us, without making us any weaker. Our reliance against tyranny is in the love of freedom and liberty which God has placed in each and every one of us. Our defense against tyranny is in the spirit which prizes freedom and liberty as the heritage of all men and all lands everywhere. Destroy that spirit, and you will have planted the seeds of tyranny at your own doorsteps. But I make you this solemn promise. No tyrannical dictator in the world with all the armies of all the earth can ever take by force one drink of water from the mighty Ohio River, or leave one single footprint in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the trial of 1,000 years. As long as the lamps of freedom and liberty burn in your hearts, there will never be any doubt that all men are created equal, and that God truly does bless America. And he has blessed me too, since my humblest beginnings. You know, we talked about being in Kentucky, that song. We left Kentucky when I was 7 years old, partially because of land titles and slavery. You see, my father was anti-slavery. He could not compete with Kentucky farmers who had slaves. So we moved to Indiana about the very month that that territory became a free state. And it was there 2 years later that my mother passed away. Well, we thought it was a plague. Everybody called it the trembles. You know, people would run a high fever and you know, they would have convulsions and later their neck would swell and their tongue. Well, it was a terrible thing. Now, my aunt and uncle, their last name was Sparrow. They were sick with the trembles. My mother went to nurse them. While she was there, she drank the milk from their cow. My aunt and uncle died 2 weeks later. My mother died. It wasn't a plague at all. It was poison milk. If the cows ate too much of a plant called white snake root, it would contaminate their milk. My father made my mother a coffin out of the wood he'd been saving to put a new door on the cabin. We had no nails of any kind. I whittled out the little wooden pegs that would hold her coffin together. And we buried her just behind the cabin up there. It was her special spot. But I tell you, I missed her. I missed her something off. Now, my sister, Sarah, now she tried to take care of me and my papa as best she could. But, folks, my sister was just 11 years old. Papa knew we needed a mother. So a year later, he left me and my sister in the care of my dumb cousin, Dennis Hanks, and he ran off to Elizabethtown, Kentucky to look up an old girlfriend of his. When he knew her, her name was Sarah Bush. And he had asked her to marry him, but she wouldn't have him, so he married my mama. And Papa found out she had married the jailer of Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Now she's Sarah Bush Johnson, and she's a widow woman with 3 children. Well, my papa gets up to her door, knocks on the door. She opens the door. She hadn't seen him probably in 25 years. She said, well, Tom Lincoln, what brings you to Elizabethtown? He said, well, Sarah, it's like this here. My young'uns ain't got no mammy, and your young'uns ain't got no pappy. Let's get married. She said yes. Folks, I had the finest stepmother that a boy could ever have. She treated me just like I was her very own son, even though she brought 3 children of her own with her. And she saw something in me. Now, see, folks, I have to correct something here. Folks would have you believe that my father did not want me to learn. No, nothing could be further from the truth. Every father wants his son to do better. You know, my mother, my birth mother, she could read. This was the only textbook in our house. The Bible. That's how I learned. I learned a lot of other things from that Bible too. When my mother was dying, she called me and my sister to her bed, and she said, children, I'm going to leave you, and I'm not coming back. She said, I want you to be kind to your father. I want you to love your heavenly Father and keep his commandments. I always remembered that. Well, anyhow, I don't know what my papa told her about our house. She had a pretty good place there in Elizabethtown. Well, she got off that wagon. She stuck her head in that cabin. Now, see, it had one door, one window, a fireplace, and a dirt floor. She spotted that dirt floor, and that was it. She said, me and my babies will live in the wagon till you put down a wooden floor. She finally did that for us. And she brought a lot of things into that home. The best thing she brought was a whole lot of love. We were a family again, happy again. More important, I had a mother again. But Papa, he couldn't be satisfied in one place long, so we left Indiana in my 21st year. We moved to Illinois. I helped my father build a cabin. We put in a crop, and I said goodbye. That's when I wound up in New Salem, Illinois, and that's when I read Lewis Payne's Age of Reason. You know, I took all kinds of jobs, too. Oh, I was a carpenter, a blacksmith, a surveyor. I was a captain in the Black Hawk Indian War. And I was a storekeeper. And after a while, New Salem got big enough that we could have a post office. So they came in and they tacked this apple crate up on the wall there, and they put post office on it. Well, now, to be a post office, you have to have a postmaster. Someone asked me why that old Democrat, Andrew Jackson, was always above my fireplace. Well, you know, we never met. But he signed the papers that made me postmaster of New Salem, Illinois. Yeah. Well, I stayed over there. Oh, when we was all fighting them Indians, by the way, I never saw but one Indian, and I had to save him. And then I met a fellow named John Stewart, and he said, Lincoln, what are you going to do when you get back to New Salem? I said, I don't know. Everything I've tried has been a failure mostly. He said, well, you can read and write. He said, you talk good. He said, people like you. They're already running you for the state legislature. He said, have you ever thought about taking up the law? I said, well, John, I can't be a lawyer. He said, why not? I said, well, I don't have any education. He said, oh, you don't need no education to be a lawyer. He said, all you have to do is read the law. Now, folks, what he meant by read the law was you would apprentice yourself to a licensed attorney. You would do all the paperwork and the attorney would get all the money. Well, I did things just my way. I read the law by myself for a year and a half. I go to John Stewart. I'd borrowed some books. I said, here you go. I've got it figured out. And he said, you've got what figured out? I said, the law. He said, oh, you've been reading these books all by yourself, and now you've got the law figured out. I said, yep, think so. He said, well, Lincoln, what was your conclusion? What is the law? I said, well, the best I can figure is right or it's wrong. The only thing I needed to get a license was a signature of 4 licensed attorneys and a sitting judge that said I was a man of good moral character and I had a working knowledge of the law. So I removed myself from New Salem and went to Springfield, Illinois. And that's when it happened. I met her. Mary Todd. Oh, I tell you, I was just struck blind, you know. I stalked her for a while. Oh, I had to back up, though. Mary came to Springfield a year before she ever saw me and before I ever saw her. She was already 20 years old. She was staying with her sister, and her sister said, Mary, what's wrong with you? Why can't you find a man? And she looked at Elizabeth. She said, Elizabeth, you don't understand. I'll never marry any man who's not capable of being the president of the United States. She was going to be the president's wife. She just hadn't met him yet. She courted Stephen Douglas. I'll get back to him later. Well, anyhow, I saw her, and I had my chance. I had to borrow a fella's coat, and I took an old lard biscuit and shined up my boots there, you know. And I walked right up to her, you know, and I just said, Miss Todd, ma'am, my name is Abraham Lincoln, and, well, golly, ma'am, I'd like to dance with you in the worst way. Unfortunately, she accepted my invitation. We began to dance. Gentlemen, I'll tell you this, it was the most romantic evening of my entire life. I twirled her across the ballroom floor about 6 times. After I stepped on her toes 16 times, she stopped me. She looked up, she said, you know, Lincoln, you're right. You do dance in the worst way. Yeah. We got married a short time later, and we've never danced with each other since. But, now look, we were so different. Look at me. I'm 6'4" tall, my stocking feet. My wife, Mary, was just about that tall. I was from a dirt poor backwoods family. She was the daughter of a wealthy Kentucky farmer. I had practically no education. She had been to the finest schools in the land. A fella asked me not long ago, he said, Lincoln, where'd you go to school? I said, I went to school by the Littles. He said, what do you mean the Littles? I said, I went a little when I was 7. I went a little when I was 9, and I went a little when I was 11. But if you wrapped it all together, it was less than 1 full year. Any store of knowledge I have now, I picked up from time to time out of necessity. Well, Mary and I married, and we had 4 boys, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. Life in Springfield was fine. I bought the only home that I ever owned. My law practice grew, and I dabbled in politics. They were no Republicans, you see. You had the Democrats and you had the Whigs. I was a Whig, by the way. And then you had the Loco-Focos and the Know-Nothings and all this stuff. Well, in 1846, I was elected to Congress as a Whig. And the only thing I managed to do in Congress was make an enemy out of President James K. Polk from Tennessee. You know, it's not a real good idea for a freshman congressman to say the President of the United States might be telling a lie. But I'm sorry. He said that Mexico had invaded the United States, and that's why we went to war with them. So I just said, well, then show me. And the American people where the first drop of American blood was spilled. It wasn't spilled on American soil. Polk had offered the Mexican government millions and millions of dollars for all that land. They didn't want to sell it, so we took it. It might surprise you that the federal Army captured Mexico City. And we thought about keeping it for a while. And I was not a candidate for re-election. Now, it wasn't because I said that. I had made an agreement with another fellow that I would serve one term. I went home and I told Mary, I said, well, Mary, my political career is finished. She said, why would you say that? I said, well, to be a successful politician, you have to have an issue. I had tried to make the Mexican War my issue, and now it was all over. So I just threw myself into my law practice. But ladies, in 1850, the first of many, many tragedies to come would strike the Lincoln home. Our second little boy, Edward, died just before his 5th birthday. I was devastated. I didn't even know that child. I mean, look, folks, I was riding a circuit as a lawyer. I'd be gone 8, 9 weeks at a time, sometimes 3 times a year. I barely knew my oldest boy. And now little Eddie's died, and I don't know him at all. We didn't have we weren't going to church, I have to confess. Mary was Episcopalian. But we didn't. Now, I went to camp meetings all the time when I was traveling. Oh, I loved to go to those camp meetings and listen to the singing. And, oh, I'd cry just like the rest of them, you know. But it wasn't, I did not have a problem with Scripture at all. I didn't have a problem with God or with Christ. But I couldn't understand why the people in that church said the people in that church couldn't go to heaven because they didn't go to that church. Well, there was a knock on the door. A gentleman said, Mr. Lincoln, my name is James Smith, and I'm the pastor of the Presbyterian Church here in Springfield. I understand you've had a loss. He came in and gave us what comfort he could. He did the boy's funeral. Mary joined the Presbyterian Church by letter. I rented a pew. That's what you did back in those days, you know. And after a while, I asked him, I said, are you the same James Smith that wrote a book called The Christian's Defense? He said, yes. You see, James Smith had been, challenged to go to Columbus, Georgia, and debate the nation's most renowned atheist. And he got down there and he whooped that guy so bad that not only did he live in Georgia, he left the country and never came back. So he had written this book, and I had found a copy of that in my father-in-law's library, you know, and it interested me somewhat. Basically what that book was, it was printed in 1843, and it was an answer to any argument that an agnostic or atheist could give you. So when I found out he was the author, I would go, and from time to time we'd read that book. And then we found out Mary was a child again. And I told her, I said, this child's going to know who his daddy is. So Willie came along, and then we had the youngest boy. Now, we named our oldest boy Robert after her daddy. He never did like me. We named the youngest one after my daddy, Thomas. You know, I called him my tadpole. She said, why would you call him a tadpole? Let's look at him. I said, he's a little bitty thing, and he got a head big as a pumpkin, you know. When he winkles on the bed, he looks just like a tadpole. So, but I was aroused to politics as never before. Now, you see, folks, our founding fathers got together, and they hashed this thing out, and for 50 years, we compromised. My ideal of a politician was Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Henry Clay was one of the first fellows that said, you know, deportation, send them back to Africa, you know. So the repeal of the Missouri Compromise and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, that was a new law that, among other things, could make slavery legal in our new states and territories as well as the old. It didn't matter what 1787. No, they said, no, we're going to forget that. They're going to go. So now I had an issue, the extension of slavery. Now, I have to admit, ladies and gentlemen, I was not an abolitionist. I was never an abolitionist. I believe some abolitionists did more harm than they did good, but I was always anti-slavery. So I hitched my wagon to the new Republican Party, and by 1858, I was running for the United States Senate. I gave my first speech in the Senate in the State House there in Springfield. I thought I had that thing up here somewhere. And I said something like this. Oh, well, I'll just wing it. I said, we are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. But under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, it's constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not believe that this government can permanently endure half slave and half free. Now, I don't expect the Union to be dissolved. I don't expect the house to fall, but I do expect that it shall cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery are going to arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind can rest in the belief that it's in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates shall push it forward. Shall it become lawful in the new states and territories as well as the old, north as well as south? My opponent for the Senate race was Mary's old boyfriend, Stephen Arnold Douglas. Now, he was this little bitty, short, fat-headed, loudmouth Democrat who everybody called the little, he's about this big, called him the little giant. Well, me and the little giant participated in a series of 7 debates, the main topics of which had absolutely nothing to do with his so-called popular sovereignty. It was always about the extension of slavery into the new states and territories. You see, friends, Stephen Douglas thought it was perfectly acceptable for one human being to buy and sell another human being just because the color of their skin was different. I kind of thought that was wrong. It was a long and bitter campaign, and I tell you, Douglas said some awful things about. Well, young lady, one time, he told the folks, he said, don't vote for this Lincoln. He's nothing but a two-faced politician. Two-faced. Now, I'll ask you the same thing I asked the judge. If I really did have 2 faces, you think I'd wear this one tonight? That reminds me of a story real quick. I came out, I was an attorney there for about 25 years. I come out of the courthouse there one day, and there was a young fella, 18, 19 years old, hey, stop. Well, I stopped, and he came running up to me, he's all out of breath. He's going, I got something belongs to you. And I said, well, I don't believe I lost anything. He said, well, I got something that belongs to you. I said, what might that be? He said, this your knife. I said, well, young man, that's a nice-looking knife, but it's not my knife. He said, yeah, it is. I said, young man, I know what my knife looks like, and that's not my knife. He said, that's your knife. I know it is. I said, all right, young man, then why don't you tell me how you know that's my knife? He said, I'll tell you how I know. He said, my pap gave me this knife 10 years ago when he throwed me off the place. And he told me that day, he said, son, if you ever see a man uglier than you are, you need to give him this knife. I've still got him. Oh, it turned out he was just teasing me. He was a nephew of an old friend of mine. But when all the ballots were counted, I lost. But 2 years later, I was nominated as one of 4 candidates for President of the United States. But ladies and gentlemen, long before any of us received the nomination, the clouds of disunion had been forming. Our nation had been facing a threat of secession since before the ink was dry on the Declaration of Independence. President Washington faced it during the Whiskey Rebellion. And not only was he willing to send troops into Pennsylvania, he said he'd lead the army himself. Andy Jackson acted just as boldly. He said he would send federal troops into South Carolina and hang every secessionist he found. And now, the Southern Democrats, you see, the Democrats had their convention in Washington. And the Southern Democrats got mad at the Northern Democrats and they went home. And then the Southern Democrats told the world in writing, they said, we will not accept the election of a Republican administration. If that happens, we'll dissolve our connection with the Union. You see, it wouldn't have made any difference which of the four of us received the nomination. They'd already made up their mind. Well, not only was, someone asked me, they said, you think the South would really go through with it? I said, I hope not. I said, I think there's cooler heads. I said, I hope not. I said, but I'm curious. I said, if that happens, what are they going to do with their half of the Union? I really wanted to know. Well, not only was I nominated, on November the 6th, 1860, I was elected in a constitutionally legal election as the 16th President of the United States and the first Republican to ever have that position. But ladies and gentlemen, I was just a president-elect. I wouldn't be the president for 3 more months. I was elected on November the 6th, 1860. December the 20th of 1860, South Carolina claimed she'd already left the Union. She was quickly followed by 6 other southern states. You see, they didn't wait to hear anything I had to say. They didn't wait to see anything I was going to do. No, they just did something they'd been planning on doing for more than 50 years. I left my home in Springfield, headed for Washington, D.C. the day before my birthday, February the 11th, 1861. I wasn't really prepared to make any sort of farewell speech because it was raining quite heavily. But when I got to the railroad depot and I stepped up on the back of the car, I looked out and I saw just a sea of umbrellas. I had to say something. My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this party. To this place, to the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I've lived for a quarter of a century, and I've passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one's buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. I go to Washington. Pinkerton, Alan Pinkerton, he was supposed to be some kind of hotshot detective. He said there was a plot to blow up the train. So they were going to take me off of one train and put me on another and disguise me, put a big old flop hat on me and a big old heavy coat, and had some woman that was supposed to be my nurse. So they snuck me into Washington. I got there at 2 a.m. in the morning. Wasn't but one congressman there to meet me. The next day, the newspapers crucified me. They called me a coward, a yellow dog. I said, my courage will never be brought into question again. March, I take the oath of office. I beg the southern states to change their minds. You know, I was willing to give them anything they wanted except the extension of slavery. I said, I have no interest in interfering with the institution of slavery in the states where it now exists. I believe the Constitution forbids me from that, and I won't do that. But I knew that we could stop it from going where it wasn't. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there was a proposed amendment to the Constitution. Read my speech. I said, I understand there's a proposed amendment to the Constitution which has passed both houses and which ratified will protect the institution of slavery in the states where it now exists for perpetuity. If that is the will of the people, so be it. But 7 states had already left. I begged them to change their mind. I said, we're not enemies. We're friends, and we mustn't be enemies. Though passions may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. But they wouldn't listen. And the truth is, they never intended to listen. And on April the 12th, 1861, the South fired on Fort Sumter. And I don't know why that happened. Because you see, the first letter I received as president was from Major Robert Anderson at Fort Sumter. He said he was surrounded by hostile forces, and unless help arrived soon, that by April the 15th, he would have no other recourse but to give up his position. So I sent a message to Anderson by courier, telling him that we would attempt to resupply, and unless we were fired upon, there would be no problems. But I said, under no circumstances put you and your men in unnecessary risk. They refused to let the message go to Anderson, but they gave it to the mayor of Charleston. He read it. He knew that Anderson was going to walk out of the fort on the 15th. The mayor gave it to Beauregard, who had been Anderson's pupil at West Point. Now Beauregard knows Anderson's going to walk out of the fort on the 15th. Beauregard gives it to Jefferson Davis. Now Jefferson Davis knows Anderson's going to walk out of the fort on the 15th. So tell me why they fired on the 12th and blamed me for starting the war. As the president, I did everything I could. I called for troops. I blockaded all the southern ports, and I began taking other measures necessary to prepare this country for a war to preserve our union. Now, our soldiers, they were losing one battle after another early in the war. Thousands and thousands of young boys were dying on battlefields everywhere. And on February the 20th of 1862, Mrs. Lincoln and I suffered another very personal loss. Our third little boy, William, we called him Willie. He died of typhoid fever in the White House. It was almost more than I could stand. And his mother, she never got over it. But friends, Mrs. Lincoln and I, we weren't the only parents that lost a son. Families both north and south were suffering tremendous losses. Why, on the 6th and 7th of April near Shiloh Church in Tennessee, 2 days of fighting left a carpet of bloody casualties. 10,000 soldiers dead, almost that many missing and wounded. And among the dead at Shiloh was my wife's half-brother, Samuel B. Todd. And ladies, Sam was in the Southern Army. She would lose 2 other half-brothers and a brother-in-law, all fighting for the South. The people in the South said my wife was a spy for the North. The people in the North said she was a spy for the South. I hope you ladies can understand why she had some emotional problems. But several months after Shiloh, on September the 17th, 1862, along Antietam Creek in Maryland, it's still the bloodiest single day in the history of America. Nearly 30,000 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing in one day. And my general claimed we won the battle. It was barely a tie, but I used it as a victory. And I used it as an excuse to do something I've been planning for almost a year and a half. On the 22nd day of September, I pinned my name to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. That document declared that as of January the 1st, 1863, that all persons held as slaves in states that were in rebellion against the Union would be forever free. But ladies and gentlemen, that piece of paper, it certainly didn't free all the slaves, because we had slaves too. We did in what we called our border states. There was Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and in the very state where I was born, in the state of Kentucky, there were 250,000 slaves. They had to wait 2 more years for the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to get their freedom. Now, if that sounds confusing to you, put yourself in the place of one of those Kentucky slaves, or better yet, heard about it. They'd all heard about it. They were ready to cast their chains off and celebrate, only to have someone come up and say, no, you see, it's those slaves down there. They're free, not you. Well, if that piece of paper didn't do anything else, it spelled the beginning of the end for the war. It made it possible for nearly 200,000 black men to join the Union Army. In the remainder of the war, those black soldiers would participate in more than 449 separate engagements. Somewhere between 40 and 50,000 black men died wearing a blue uniform. 24 of those brave black soldiers received the Congressional Medal of Honor. One of the black men that received the Medal of Honor did not get it for what he did with a weapon. He got it for protecting the American flag. Now I ask myself, what would make a black man throw down his rifle, the only thing he had to protect himself with, and then pick up a flag that at that moment was still denying him equality? I don't know why they did it, but I thank God every day they did. Make no mistake. If we hadn't had the help of those black soldiers, I think the war could have gone on indefinitely. And you know, the proclamation wasn't working. It just wasn't. I asked Frederick Douglass, I said, why aren't they coming? Why aren't they coming by the thousands? He said, Mr. President, don't you know the master's got ways of keeping this news for those people? So I decided that we needed more help than I could give the country. Now, I did not write every proclamation that I signed, but I read everything, and I would scratch through or add to. So on March 30th, 1863, I penned my name to a proclamation calling for a national day of fasting and prayer. Now, it's like all proclamations. It's very wordy in the beginning and at the end. But in the middle, this is what it said. It is the duty of nations as well as of men to owe their dependence upon the overruling power of God, to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, to recognize the sublime truth announced in Holy Scriptures and proven by all history that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord. And insomuch as we know that nations, like individuals, are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that the terrible calamity which now desolates our great land is but a punishment inflicted upon us for the presumption of our national sins. We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We've been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We've grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand that preserved us in peace, multiplied, enriched, and strengthened us, and we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our own hearts that all of these many blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of a redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to pray for clemency and forgiveness. And when this is done, let us rest in a hope authorized in divine teachings that the united cry of the nation will be heard on high and answered with blessings no less than a pardon of our national sins and the restoration of our now suffering and divided country to its normal happy condition of unity and peace. And yet the war went on. And it got worse. It always got worse. On the first 3 days of July in the year 1863, in and around a small little Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, was fought the bloodiest battle ever to take place on the North American continent. 50,000 American lives vanished into the mist and smoke and flame of a human storm. Several months later, I was in that little town. I'd been invited by the governor of Pennsylvania to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of the cemetery where our soldiers were. I was not the main speaker, however. They made sure another man got that honor. His name was Edward Everett. Edward Everett was the most famous speaker in America. He stood on the platform that day. He addressed the crowd for almost 3 hours. His speech was 30 pages long. Tell me something he said. I spoke a little less than 3 minutes. My entire speech only has 10 sentences in it. 272 words. And if any educators among you, only 18 of those words had more than 3 syllables. And even though I thought it was complete failure, some people said they remembered it. This is what I said on that cold November afternoon. And you see, why did I say 77? 77. 87 years. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition Civil War, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We're met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living in debt who struggle here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, no long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It's for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It's rather that we be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And yet the war went on, and it got worse. I stopped listening to my so-called military advisors, and in March of 1864, I promoted Ulysses S. Grant to the rank of Lieutenant General. He was the first man since George Washington to get that rank. I asked him one question. I said, Grant, tell me you got a plan to end it. He just leaned back and he said, I do, Mr. President. It's simple. I said, simple? Man, we've been killing each other wholesale for 3 years, and now you tell me it's simple? He said, yes, sir, Mr. President. It's mathematics. He said, it's always been mathematics. He said, well, we got more of everything. He said, they can't replace their losses. He said, the South is refusing to exchange black prisoners. He said, they can't keep it up. Ladies and gentlemen, people thought the war was bad before. But when Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan took over, they taught the entire planet what true warfare was all about. Ulysses S. Grant lost 7,000 soldiers at Cold Harbor in 20 minutes. He sent 7,000 more right behind him. Even my wife called him a butcher. But look at the results. I gave him the army in March of 64. By March of 65, it was almost over. And in March of 65, I became the first president since Andy Jackson to take the oath of office for a second term. My second inaugural address is still the shortest inaugural address of any president before me or after me. And the next day, some of the newspapers criticized it terribly. One headline read, poor, poor President Lincoln. When did he become a preacher? Why does he insist on delivering a sermon instead of an inaugural address? You folks will have to be the judge. This is part of what I said on that day. I said, my countrymen, on the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. Both sides deprecated war, but one side would make war rather than see the Union preserved, and the other side would accept war rather than see the Union perish, and the war came. Both sides read the same Bible. Both sides prayed to the same God, and each invoked his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered, and the prayers of neither have been answered fully. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it should continue, until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk. till every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be repaid by another drawn by the sword. As it was said 3,000 years ago, so still must it be said today, that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity to all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work that we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And finally, April the 9th, 1865, after nearly 900,000 Americans had died, Robert E. Lee and his army surrendered. For all intent and purposes, the war was over. Lee surrendered on the 9th. I made a speech on the 11th. I don't know what I did on I tell you what I did on the 13th, though. That was last night, Thursday night. I slept all night long for the first time in 3 years. It was marvelous. I got up this morning and I said, it's Friday. Oh, and it's Good Friday, too, and it's going to be a good Friday. I did something else I haven't done in 3 years. I had breakfast with the family. Me and Mrs. Lincoln, my oldest boy, he's there. He was come back from Appomattox, and our youngest boy, Ted. We finished breakfast, and Robert took a card, and he slid it across the table. He said, Pa, I brought you something from Appomattox. I picked it up, and it was a portrait of Robert E. Lee. I looked at it for the longest time, and I said, that's a good face. That's a fine and noble face, and I hope now this war's finally over. I had a little cabinet business to take care of, and then Mary and I did something we hadn't done in a long time. We took a carriage ride. Oh, the flowers are blooming, the trees are out. I told the driver, put the top down. We got down by the Navy Yard, and after a while, Mary looked at me, and she says, Father, you frightened me today. I said, frighten you? Why? She says, I haven't seen you this happy since our little boy died. I said, well, Mother, with this terrible war and the loss for our boys, I said, both of us been very miserable. I said, but Mary, today I believe this war's finally over. And I tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to finish out this term of office, and then we're going to go back to Springfield. I'll take up my law practice, make us a little money. You know, I always wanted to go out there to California. And I did tell her, I said, Mary, I hope you don't think I'm a hypocrite, but I kind of like to go to them Holy Lands one time, walk where all them prophets walked, you know. Well, we got back just a little while ago, and I got some other stuff I got to take care of. And I'm going to tell you, folks, right now, I'm exhausted, and nothing to make me happier than just go right up them stairs and fall back on that feather bed again, but it ain't going to happen. She's got tickets just to go see some play tonight. So last night's going to be there. It's supposed to be a comedy, a rip-roarer, they said. I invited Grant and his wife. They said no. I invited 3 other couples. They said no. Then Mary says, well, we just won't go. And I said, well, we have to go. She said, why do we have to go? I said, you put it in the paper. So I've hijacked me this young Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Her daddy's an old congressman somewhere. So if I don't get up there now, because, see, I can't go to the theater like this. No, I got to get all gussied up. You know, white tie and tail. Have to take a cane. I don't need a cane. So, all right, this is you're going to get late. All right, tell you what we're going to do. This is Friday. This is Friday. Whoa. How about that? This is Friday. Okay, now, come back. Don't come Monday. Come back Wednesday. Come to the executive mansion on Wednesday. See old man Cook. He's the doorman there. And tell him that I had talked with you and told you a little bit about my life, and tell him that I said that you could come, not all at once, you know, just a few at a time, because I kind of like to hear, you know, something from, you know, if you had relatives, or just hear your side of it. So, but I guess, well, you know what, I think it's just best that I wish you an affectionate farewell. Good night. Whew. Whew. Ta-da.
Mr. Dennis Boggs is Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how many have not seen Dennis perform before? That's
Yeah.
quite an effort, don't you think? That's awesome. Thanks again, Dennis. And for those of you who don't know, and you weren't here at Easter 2 years ago, we've got Judas in the fourth row back here.
Judas is back sitting
Judas
there.
back there.
Yeah, I see him. Yeah.
And we had Abe was our Jesus at the Last Supper, the Living Last Supper play. So, and he did
Charlie-
a good one.
Charlie calls me. He said, hey, we're doing a living last supper. I never heard of nothing like this. So I went home, I started looking up. They do it all over the world, you know. I thought, okay. And he said, I'm short a disciple. I said, look, Charlie, I can't be a disciple. And he wouldn't leave it alone. He kept on, he said, wait a minute. And I said, okay, I'll be a disciple. I said, I don't want to be Judas. He said, oh, we got a good Judas. And so I said, okay, I'll be a disciple. Now, all of a sudden, he called me back. My Jesus got cold feet. I told him, I said, Charlie, I can't do Jesus. He said, why? I said, I'm 75 years old. And he, oh, you can do it. Nobody knows. And, you know, I did not want to do that. But I will tell you, it was one of the biggest spiritual experiences I had, seeing these men tell this story. Yeah, even though I had to wash everybody's feet. But Charlie and I have known each other for a long, long time. And, you know, being Abraham Lincoln was the last thing on my bucket list. I was in the grocery business for 30-something years, and I got involved in community theater way late in my life. And, you know, I did a play 34 years ago. I did a one-act play about Abraham Lincoln. I didn't know anything about Lincoln. And it just, so I just started my 26th year doing this full time. I've had my Lincoln in 44 states. I was in Washington 6 times last year. And I was sitting in the airport, and a lady came up. I wasn't dressed like this. The lady came up, can I have a picture with you? Well, I never say no, so she took a picture. She said, you got a card? So I gave her a card. A little while later, this gentleman comes by, suit and tie. I said, lady, give me your card. I'd like to know more. I said, sit down. So we talked a little bit, and he was just asking question after question. I said, look, if you really want some information, just go to my website. He said, I've already done that. He said, you do school programs? I said, yeah. He said, what grade level? I said, preschool to college. He said, well, have you ever been to Louisiana? I said, it's odd that you should ask. I said, Louisiana is the only secession state that I've never had my Lincoln in. He said, so you're going now? I spoke at LSU. How does that happen? Come on. There's old Abe himself. But thanks for coming out. And Charlie, thank you for having me.
Hey,
Yeah.
two things.
Yeah.
Explain what that little half-built obelisk is in the window.
Oh, this little thing right there. Now, see, this is the Lincoln office from the Spielberg movie. Now, they went to so much trouble to get
We lose your battery. Your battery.
those insignificant things right, like the wallpaper.
Battery went
The wallpaper, the desk over here. See, there's a door there. They put a false wall there because Lincoln could. Its thing was on wheels, and he could go to his living quarters without having to get out in the hallway. But in the film, this is a white curtain. But I have a friend of mine that does Benjamin Franklin, so he did a little photoshopping on it, and it took me a little bit while I noticed it. I said, "Is that what I think it is?" He said, "Yeah, it's the unfinished Washington Monument, because the president could look out his window and see that, you know." Again, they went to so many. Everybody wanted, what'd you think of the movie? I said, well, I didn't like the title. And they said, well, it was Lincoln. I said, that's not what the film was about. It was about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. There were some things in there that never happened. It's Hollywood, okay? But, okay, there's a scene where Daniel Day-Lewis is deep in thought. You know, they're arguing for this 13th Amendment, and he has his watch on the watch stand in front of him, and it's ticking. Spielberg's people went to the Smithsonian. They said, you won't let us borrow the watch. They said, no. They said, does it work? We said, we don't know. So they wound it up. So that ticking, that was Abraham Lincoln's watch. And at the Studebaker Museum over in Fort Wayne. Studebaker, before they made cars, they made wagons and carriages and everything. In the back of their museum, they have several carriages. They have one that belonged to Lafayette. They had one that belonged to Grant, one that belonged to Garfield. And they have the carriage that Abraham and Mary drove to Ford's Theater in. It's not a Studebaker. But the Spielberg people went over there because in the film, they're in and out of these carriages all the time. And what did they do? They recorded the sound of the handle and the door. I mean, stuff like that. And then it's just so. But, you know, Hollywood is Hollywood. Sometimes it confuses us.
So where are you going to spend July 4th this year?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I am going someplace.
Yeah.
But I can't remember where else.
You're going to South Dakota.
Where?
Aren't you going to Mount Rushmore? Or is that a different date?
Where?
Mount Rushmore.
Oh, I'm not. Oh, no.
That's
That's going to be in. It's going to be in June if it comes up. This lady called me and she said, "Are you the guy that does Abe Lincoln?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm one of them." She said, "Well, good." She said, "We're going to do with the 250th coming up. We're going to do a thing about Mount Rushmore, and we want Lincoln and Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, and Roosevelt." I said, "Well, we don't call that Mount Rushmore." She said, "What do you mean you don't call it Mount Rushmore?" I said, "We call it the three surveyors and the other guy. Teddy Roosevelt wasn't a surveyor." But, you know, ladies and gentlemen, give me that thing. Listen, I'm a little...